I'm Kelly Hancock. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the American Civil War Museum here in Richmond, Virginia. And Stephanie Arduini is also on the line or on Zoom. She's our Director of Education and has a much larger title than that, but I'll leave it at that part. But welcome, and as always, what I like to do is start out with some announcements about all the great programs that we have coming up. And even though our doors are closed, we are very busy virtually. So on May 11th, our History Happy Hour will be at 6:30, and we'll have with us Dr. Nicole Turner speaking on Black churches in the post-emancipation struggle. And then on May 18th, which is another Monday at 6:30, once again, we'll have with us Dr. Rachel Lance speaking about her book, In the Waves, and her quest to solve the mystery of the Hunley, the H.L. Hunley, the famous submarine that sunk. And then on May 26th, this is a Thursday night at 6:30, we are going to be doing our Foundry Series program. Oh no, I'm sorry, May 26th is actually another History Happy Hour that was scheduled for our Appomattox area. It will be taking place online at 6:30. We'll have Beth Parnitska from the National Park Service, Such is War, the Looting of Fredericksburg. And then our Foundry Series on May 28th, which is a Thursday night, Humans and the Environment. And we will have with us Dr. Timothy Silver and Judkin Browning, and speaking based off of their book, Environmental History of the Civil War. And hopefully we'll also end that program with a bit of a panel discussion related to the environment and humans today. So those are all the great programs that we have coming up. And now what I want to do is go ahead and introduce our author for this evening, our speaker, Dr. Adam H. Domby. He is an award-winning historian of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the American South. He is an assistant professor at the College of Charleston and the associate director of the Pearlstine Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture. So I'm going to turn the program over to Adam.
Excellent. Well, thank you for introducing me. And it's so great to get to make your acquaintance, not in person yet, but hopefully soon when this is all over. And sounds like you have a great set of speakers coming up. I know a few of them already. I've gotten to hear a few of those speak, and don't miss Dr. Turner's talk or Judkin Browning's talk. I know both of them, and they're great scholars that are not to be missed if you get a chance. So, well, first off, let me just thank everyone for coming today to hear a little bit about my book, The False Cause, Fraud, Fabrication, and White Supremacy in Confederate Memory. And we'll put out the, if you guys can send the link out again to everyone, for those who just joined, we'll put out the link to the UVA Press. They're having a sale right now. If you pay attention, you can actually get the book. If you type in 10 read at the in the code at the end, you'll get a 30% discount. And so thank you again, though, for having me to speak. My plan today is just to give a little introduction to a little bit about the book, tell you a few stories from the book, and then take questions so you guys can ask any questions that you may have. And see a lot of friendly faces out there, so thank you all for joining us. And this is a book that I did not necessarily expect to write. I didn't set out to write it. I didn't necessarily, I thought at the time that this might be a couple of articles. I had sort of two projects that were supposed to happen after I took my dissertation and turned into a book. I was going to move on to these sort of article length projects that I thought would be really interesting. One of which was about pension fraud and how people lied about their military service during the Civil War to get pensions. I thought this would be a neat little sort of short article. And then I had another article I wanted to do about Civil War monuments. and Confederate monuments, specifically about the way that stories were fabricated around and used to create the lost cause at dedications, and the way that sort of during the Jim Crow era, stories that were not true, false stories, were again and again used to help uphold a narrative which was then used to uphold white supremacy. And I thought these were two different projects. And in time, I came to realize that they were in fact the same project. They were two sides of the same coin. That the lies around pension fraud were actually tied to the acceptance of the lost cause by so many white Southerners who probably should have known better or did know better, but the lies served a convenient purpose. And so they were allowed to continue. And so I want to go through just a little bit about sort of what I mean by lies and the lost cause. Now, the lost cause is sort of a term that historians use for a dominant narrative that was crafted after the Civil War to explain what had happened during the war. It's a narrative about the war that white Southerners, specifically Confederate supporting white Southerners, had propagated. And it included some sort of key elements. Now, of course, everyone who has their understanding of the Civil War has a slightly different understanding. But there are certain key elements that seem to be shared across most of those who were sort of pushing this one narrative, which we call the lost cause, if you will. And the first sort of key aspect of that is the denial that slavery had anything to do with the war. And this is sort of a central aspect of the first chapter of the book. It looks at why exactly it is that despite the fact that the Articles of Secession that each Southern state passed make very clear why the war or why secession occurred, they denied it after the fact. South Carolina was very explicit. Mississippi was very explicit. If you'd asked anyone in 1861, what is this war about? What is the sort of root cause of it? No one would have said slavery has nothing to do with it. They all would have said, oh yeah, slavery has something to do with it. Slavery has everything to do with it. And so that's an important sort of starting point. But why erase it? And a lot of people think they're erasing it because they're embarrassed after the fact about having fought for slavery. I'm not actually convinced that's the dominant driving force in the early years. I think that is a force now when people deny it. I think that is a motivation when someone says this Confederacy had nothing to do with slavery. It has to do with nobody wants to be tied to slavery. But in, say, the 1890s or the early 1900s, at the turn of the century, the white Southerners who were pushing this narrative were not embarrassed about slavery. They were embarrassed perhaps about losing. At the same time as they were denying that slavery had anything to do with the Civil War, they would defend that slavery was a positive institution and argue that it was a civilizing institution, that it was an institution that was benevolent, and that many enslaved people were quite happy. And so that kind of takes me to a second element that's key to the lost cause, is a denial of the horrors of slavery. And let us be clear, slavery is a horrible institution that was premised on terror, violence, and the threat of violence, and torture, and murder, or killing, to extract labor. That is fundamental. Our American newspapers openly advertised sex slaves for sale in the 1850s. You can't really deny that. We have the documents. And so when we sort of take into account that slavery is terrible, but they're denying slavery is terrible while also denying slavery had anything to do with the cause of the war, it's because if you fought a war for slavery in the 1860s and you're looking back on it 20 years later, slavery's dead. You lost. If you fought a war, though, for, say, states' rights, you didn't lose necessarily. States' rights are still there. And you actually see in some of the dedication speeches that people will actually say, this was not a defeat, it was a compromise. And this is one of my favorite speeches, is the speech someone gives where they say, at Appomattox, there was not a surrender, it was a compromise. And I know we have David Silkenet here, who, if you look at his excellent book on surrender, he will tell you that in fact it was a surrender. And so, but why deny it? Because then you're not a loser. And additionally, states' rights, saying we fought for states' rights and states' rights still exist, is such an important aspect of defending Jim Crow and keeping federal intervention out when you're looking at sort of the way that white Southerners are trying to keep Northern politicians from, say, passing an anti-lynch law or interfering with the disenfranchisement of African Americans. And so it sort of is a key element in defending Jim Crow and segregation. So when you take those sort of things into account, it starts to make sense, right, as we move along. Now, there are other elements as well. For instance, the argument that Confederate soldiers were perhaps the greatest soldiers of all time, other than maybe the Spartans at Thermopylae, and they were only defeated because of overwhelming numbers, but they fought nobly, they fought valiantly, they fought in a way that they could be proud of. And while historians have sort of looked at the issue of slavery and the issue of the causes of the war, and you won't really find a reputable Civil War scholar who's going to argue that the Civil War wasn't about slavery or had nothing to do with slavery. You're not going to find any reputable scholar who's like, yes, slavery was benevolent. You're not going to find it. It's not, they're not reputable if they're arguing that. Certain aspects of the larger narrative about Confederate soldiers has remained in our historiography. And there is still an expectation among many historians, especially those historians who are, say, focused on something else in their writing and are sort of filling in the gaps to sort of keep their narrative moving along, to fall back on an old narrative that Confederate soldiers were really impressive. And so a lot of scholars have asked this question: why did the Confederacy last so long? And I flipped that question around in my second chapter and asked, perhaps the reason we asked that question of why they lasted so long is because of the fabricated stories that I'll tell you about in a moment that were propagated after the war. Whether or not they really did fight well is another question, but and not one that the book necessarily answers. It sort of opens up. But I will put it out this way. I think perhaps the question we should be asking is, why did the Confederacy fail so quickly? When you sort of think about it on the grand scale, the United States military in 1860 is around 16,000 men. And it would have to grow to be hundreds of thousands of men by the end of the Civil War. In just essentially 4.5 years, it would grow, in less than 4.5, basically 4 years, it grows to a massive force. And you have to train that force, you have to mobilize that force. So you could also say that the Confederacy lasted a remarkably short time. And so I think the next question for historians going forward is to reassess the Confederate soldier when we look at sort of with the questions of historical memory in mind. And so we've sort of mentioned a few of those sort of aspects of the lost cause that are so problematic already. We'll add one more, and we sort of hinted at it already, that slavery was benevolent and that slaves were happy. And that sort of is something I bring up in later chapters as you begin to really dive in. And that myth that enslaved people were happy evolves over time. And Kevin Levine has written a new book that goes into this in depth. I have a chapter and a half on the topic of how these loyal slave narratives, these narratives about how happy slaves were and how loyal they were to the owners, evolved into a new lie. So one lie, because the reality is hundreds of thousands of enslaved Americans ran away and joined the United States military. By the end of the war, 10% of the United States military is African American. That is a massive shift in manpower. When you think about that, it is a shift in manpower that is larger than the Army of Northern Virginia, the sort of key Confederate army. When you take into account that you have somewhere in the order of 200,000 African Americans and another 100,000 white Southerners who are not fighting for the Confederacy or working in the case of those enslaved people, they would not have been allowed to enlist. Those myths, though, those myths that these enslaved people were happy, they end up shifting into a new lie that there were thousands of Black Confederate soldiers. there is no evidence of thousands of Black Confederate soldiers. There is evidence that there were thousands of African Americans forced to labor in trenches with the Confederate Army. They did not volunteer. And many of them ran away. And this is something that is another area where scholars still need to research. And it's a future project of mine, is actually looking at how many do run away. And every time they run away, it's worth remembering that these enslaved people are bringing key vital intelligence to the United States military when they arrive. They're able to say, yeah, I just escaped from Confederate lines. Here's exactly where the trenches are. And I don't think that we've fully accounted as historians for the sort of the importance of that intel over the course of the war. And it's a book I'd like to see written in the future. But so there's all of this sort of mythology, though. Why does it matter? Why are these lies happening? It's not just because Confederate soldiers or Confederate veterans want to be able to say, we were noble Confederate veterans. We were valiant. It's because the mythology of the lost cause is then used in turn to justify disenfranchisement of African Americans and justify our racial hierarchy. And so I want to turn now to just one quick story to tell this story. And it's sort of a central story in how I came to write this book. It's a central story that is still unfolding. And it's the story of the Confederate monument at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, also known as Silent Sam. And it's the monument that sort of drew me to this, and it's how I got into this topic. I never expected to write on this topic of the lost cause until my first year of grad school. I was taking a class on monuments and memory, and I thought, I need a research project for the final paper of the semester. What do I write on? Oh, it'll be easy. I'll write on the local monument. It's right here. How hard can it be? I looked online, and I was able to, or I looked very quickly into some new, actually it wasn't online at the time. Now you can find it online, but I looked on some microfilm. I found the speeches. They were very easy that had been many of the speeches that had been given by the governor the day it was dedicated. It was dedicated in 1913. And it mentions in the newspaper articles that two Confederate soldiers spoke, Henry London and Julian Carr, but they didn't print those speeches. And in retrospect, I know why they didn't print the speeches. It was because they were largely unremarkable. They were basically the same speech that Julian Carr gave again and again, over and over again. So if anyone ever says, well, Julian Carr's speech is just his opinion. Now, Julian Carr's speech was his opinion that he gave all the time and everyone had already heard, and that's why they invited him to speak, so he could give it again. They knew when they invited Julian Carr what his views were, and that's important for this story. Julian Carr was sort of the leading Confederate veteran. And I didn't realize this at the time, that he was such a leading Confederate veteran. I didn't really know who he was, but I knew when I did a quick search that we had the Julian Carr papers on campus. So I went upstairs, literally from the microfilm room, to the Southern collection. And I said, can I see the Julian Carr papers? I want to see his speeches from this year. And there was literally a folder for 1913 in. So I just pulled out that folder, opened it up, and there it was. And no one had really looked at it. A few scholars had looked at it, but hadn't linked it the importance of the story. And here's the importance. When Carr gave his speech, he talked about what this monument meant. And he had all the typical lost cause aspects. The Confederate soldier was the greatest soldier, that we fought for home and country and sort of ignoring slavery as a role in the war, that we were valiant, that we will be sort of vindicated in the end. And then he said, and this monument isn't just a monument to the war. It's a monument to the period after the war, the 4 years after the war, so Reconstruction. When he says, Confederate veterans saved the Anglo-Saxon race. In other words, they saved the white race. And he says, and when he basically explains, and I won't go into the whole sort of, it's all drawn out language for the time, but anyone who listened to it at the time would have known what he was saying was, when we stopped African Americans from having political power. Now, lest anyone thinks he meant just political victory. No, he meant the violence of the Klan. And he would later admit that he was a Klan member during the 1860s, and he would rejoin the Klan again when it was reborn in the 20th century. And he would openly admit that as well. So this is not something he was shy about saying. It's literally in the newspaper. That's how I found it. And he says, let me tell you my part in overturning African-American enfranchisement and African-American political power, is the gist of it. He says, and this is where I'll do the quote, because I don't want to say it in my own words. I want to be clear. This is his words. He said, not 90 days after Appomattox, so we're talking within 3 months of the end of the war, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirt hung in shreds. And I can still remember reading that in the archives, the feeling I had in the pit of my stomach. It was one of those moments you're like, holy bleep, I can't believe this is here. And anyone who's a historian knows the feeling of when you find that smoking gun document where you're like, this is something I can write on. It's an amazing feeling. And I immediately went out and grabbed the archivist. Was like, do we know about this? And the archivist was like, what are you talking about? I know nothing what you're talking about. Show us what you're talking about. So clearly no one had known about it, or at least no one recently had sort of paid attention. There were a few scholars who'd seen this violence and seen it as an example of violence. They hadn't seen it as tied to this monument. So in his mind, he was saying, this is a monument to overturning Reconstruction. And that's important because Confederate monuments don't go up in 1865, and they don't go up in 1870, and most of them don't go up in 1880. And in North Carolina, most of them don't even go up in the 1890s. There's a few that go up in the 1890s, but they start going up after 1901, which is an important date, because that is when African Americans were disenfranchised. And there was something to celebrate if you're a white supremacist. And again, as you start reading the dedication day speeches that were given at each dedication, at UNC, at every small town in North Carolina, you see an open acknowledgement that these monuments celebrate white supremacy. And even those that don't openly announce that, you have to remember that Confederate monuments, by their very nature, are designed to celebrate white men, because there are no Black Confederates. So you're inherently celebrating Black men. And this story of this noble Confederate soldier plays a really important rhetorical role, not only in the placing of these monuments, but in the conservative Democrats' rhetoric. And this is the sort of, before the party realignment, they considered themselves, the Democrats considered themselves the conservative party in North Carolina. In fact, during the 1870s, or 1860s, they actually called themselves the Conservative Party. 1860s, they called themselves the Conservative Party before they take the name the Democratic Party. And they take this sort of, this belief in white supremacy, and they take this story of the Confederate, this noble Confederate soldier, and they mesh them together. And it becomes part of their justification for disenfranchisement. They say again and again, African Americans have to prove that they should be allowed to vote. White people have proved it through their valor at Gettysburg. Now, of course, this is dependent upon there being valor at Gettysburg. And so remembering Confederate soldiers as noble and not running away and not surrendering and fighting valiantly is crucial if you're going to uphold this argument that African Americans should be disenfranchised. By the same token, you can't remember the United States colored troops, because then they proved themselves worthy of voting as well. And so these sort of rhetoric of the Confederacy again and again comes back. And Julian Carr repeatedly used his credentials as a Confederate veteran, I should point out, to prove he was a big enough white supremacist. So in 1900, he runs for the US Senate. It's the first primary in North Carolina for a Senate seat. There's 4 major candidates. All of them try to out-white supremacist the other guy. They try to be the biggest white supremacist. And Carr comes under criticism for not being racist enough. They say he's too friendly to African Americans because he's willing to do business with them. And to prove his chops, he'll be like, I'm a Confederate veteran, so you know I fought for white supremacy. So in his mind, fighting for the Confederacy was all about white supremacy, and he's open about it. He loses, in part because he is perhaps, at least on the Democratic side, too moderate. Now, of course, he's only moderate if you take only account for his party. If you take the larger span of North Carolina politics in the 1890s and early 1900s, there's a North Carolina senator who's elected by a biracial coalition in the 1890s during the fusion movement. And so he's only moderate once disenfranchisement is firmly in place. He's not a moderate if you actually look at the politics of the larger population of the state, only the voting population post-1900. And that's important to remember, because Carr is involved in creating the Solid South, both through disenfranchisement and through a fabricated memory that whites have always worked together. He's erasing a memory that whites had historically, or large numbers of North Carolina whites had voted in a biracial alliance during Reconstruction, during the fusion movement, because they want to keep anyone from remembering the war that way. They want every white voter to think, the Democratic Party is the party of the white man. I have to vote for the Democratic Party. They create a memory of the Solid South that is fabricated. And so all of these fabrications play a role. And among them, they combine to uphold what I call the biggest lie of them all, that there is a superior race, right? It's that all these little lies. And so to sort of dig into sort of some of the other chapters for a moment. So that's sort of the monuments aspect. And these monuments, again, I think when we're talking about Confederate monuments, we got to take them on their own ground. We got to accept when they were put up for a reason, and they told us why they put them up. And we can take them at their word. It's not a really advanced approach to history in some ways to just say, all right, I'll take you at your word. When you said you put this monument up for white supremacy, you put it up for white supremacy. Now, as we look sort of more broadly, there are other lies that are smaller. For instance, my third chapter looks at pension fraud. In the early 20th century, the state of North Carolina, as other southern states did, began issuing pensions for white men who had fought for the Confederacy. And they were smaller than the federal pensions, but they were also a lot easier to get. They did not almost ever investigate anyone's pension claim. The only reason they'd investigate you if they thought you already made enough money or you weren't actually disabled and you could work. That they would perhaps not but boot you, but for not serving well. Now, technically you couldn't desert and still get a pension, but nobody investigates it. And in fact, the really funny thing is 2 years in, in 1903, they change the definition of desertion, so that if you deserted but were arrested and brought back to war, you could still get a pension. They literally make it easier to avoid being called a deserter because it's causing too many problems. So all you have to do is say, oh yeah, I went back before the end of the war. The records just don't show it, and you get your pension. They make it very easy. Now, the truth of the matter is we can look at these records. We can compare these pension records, which for many years, especially genealogists, have used as evidence of noble military service. Genealogists and historians, to a lesser extent, have looked at these stories and said, look, my ancestor or this figure that I'm looking at, they fought valiantly. But if you go and look at their compiled service records, which are now online, which are basically an index of wartime documents that used to be much harder to access than it is now, but because of the internet, Fold 3 now makes it very easy to do this research comparatively. You can find that these guys are deserting left and right, and they're not returning home. Some of them are going to Union lines, and they're taking an oath of allegiance. Some of them enlist in the United States Army and are sent out west. A few of them even apply for U.S. federal pensions at the same time they're applying for Confederate pensions, and they're ineligible for both, because they aren't eligible for a federal pension because they fought for the Confederacy, and they aren't eligible for Confederate pension because they fought for the United States government. And they know that, and so they lie about it in both cases. And it's easier, they tend to get the Confederate pension, but not the US pension, is the interesting thing. And so there's a lot of talk by sort of conservative politicians in the South in the early 20th century that federal pensions are a big fraud and they're all full of fraudulent people. It's way easier to get a Confederate pension. And what we find is, looking at one county, I dove into one county so that I could sort of zero in, somewhere in the order of 10% of the pensioners aren't actually eligible for the pension. And that includes deserters. It includes guys who took up arms against the Confederacy, enlisted in the Union Army, never served at all, and in a few cases were born after the war ended. And so what they're doing is that they are, in fact, realizing that being a noble Confederate gives you social capital and monetary capital. In fact, I just finished an article that's going out to Civil War Monitor. I'll give you a sneak peek at what's coming down the line, about New York's last Confederate veteran. New York's last Confederate veteran, nobody's really looked at he dies in 1945, supposedly, this guy, and he's celebrated, and for years they put up a United States flag and a Confederate flag on his grave, and we can use him to celebrate reconciliation. We'll just forget about all the racial aspects and how that plays a role when we do this sort of memory. And the fact that he fought against the United States flag. We'll put in a United States flag and a Confederate flag because it's this sort of memory that associates Confederate soldiers as the same as United States soldiers, and they're not, right? Because the Confederate soldiers shoot at U.S. soldiers. They're fundamentally different than a U.S. soldier. But this memory of this guy is used to sort of romanticize the war, if you will, for years. Well, it turns out he was not a Confederate veteran. He wasn't getting money per se. He wasn't getting a pension because New York didn't give a pension, but he got a lot of social capital. He got invited to parties. And when he was in trouble financially, the local sort of benevolent organizations would help him out. And he would get taken on vacation by the local GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic Veterans Organization, would take him as sort of a mascot to the local reunions and be like, here's our token Confederate at the reunions. And he would always toe the line, this sort of line of, oh, we all should be friends now. And I don't even remember why we fought, right? As long as you towed the line and said you were a loyal Confederate, you could get a lot of benefits in society in the 1920s, 1930s, even into the 1950s, the early 1950s, such that the last 12 Confederate veterans were not Confederate veterans. They were fakes. In fact, the last Confederate Veterans Reunion had no veterans at it. You had three guys sitting around a table hoping no one else would realize that they were fakes, although they may not have remembered it because at that point they were all claiming they were over 100. So they were quite elderly at this point. And now it's not all just about money, although that's part of it. A lot of these people really did need this money. You have to remember, this was serving as a welfare program before we had welfare. If the state didn't cover the pittance that a Confederate veteran's pension was, the county's going to have to pick up that money. So the county clerk who's responsible for ensuring that this is true, and the county officials who are sort of making sure that these guys are legit, they're incentivized to fulfill it. And furthermore, it's a form of patronage that gets you votes. And this is a really interesting aspect. You actually see this in the letters, that people will write letters to the sort of pension officials saying, my pension got denied. I promise I'll vote for you next time if you get me my pension. And there'll be letters applying going, okay, we'll give you a pension now. And there's even a rush job in one case where they're like, we got to get this letter to him to let him know because the election's in 3 days or a couple days. Let him know his pension will be back on so that he votes our ticket. And so it's a form of patronage. It's a form of rewarding them for how they vote. And so, but what happens with all these sort of little lies with these guys, they're not necessarily worried about white supremacy who are telling the lies. Those lies get used, and these guys get remembered as heroes. And so the next generation learns that all white Southern men fought for the Confederacy, essentially, and that they all fought valiantly because there's no memory of anyone deserting. There's only a memory of these valiant Confederate veterans who are slowly dying off among our midst. And so it gets propagated to future generations. The Confederates were all loyal. In reality, North Carolina had the highest desertion rates of any state in the Civil War. They also were one of the last to secede, and they had some of the highest numbers of recusant conscripts or draft dodgers across the South. And so they have the most to cover up, which is why I study North Carolina as a sort of case study. And so as we look at sort of pension fraud, this is where I sort of mentioned at the beginning how I said that these sort of come together, these two stories, the story of the monuments and the story of pension fraud, is those lies that all white men fought valiantly are then used to disenfranchise African Americans. And so they're really the same story. And you see another story about loyal slaves, this myth that there are all these loyal slaves who really, and they always have the same story practically. The story is always the same. I carried my master home after they were injured or died. And they're not eligible. I should point this out. This is an important. They do become eligible for pensions. If you were an enslaved person who went to war with your master, you could actually get a pension. It's like an early form of reparations, you could argue. And that's actually how it's seen by some people. Not everyone. I don't know that it's the best way of seeing it, but I think some of the people who get those reparations see it that way. They're sort of like, I was never paid. They literally will say in their application, I was never paid for my labor, so this is my back pay. And so if they went and dug trenches and stayed and did what they were told, they're eligible for a significantly smaller pension. It's not equivalent to a Confederate pension. It's a smaller amount of money. Your widow isn't eligible for it. And it's not until in North Carolina until much later that you're able to get one. It's literally over 20 years later. And so there's a very small number. There's less than 400 of them ever issued. But these men are able to use a Jim Crow system designed to oppress them to find money to support their own family. And in the case of the last Class B pensioner, he himself was lying. Just as veterans lied to get their pensions, so did some of these so-called loyal slaves, but they serve a really useful purpose to those white supremacist politicians because they can be held up as an example of the way racial relations should react. Because if you can see the world, imagine for a moment, as slavery was a time of good race relations where everyone got along, and then you can see this example of this happy, supposedly, enslaved person. And then you say, the reason we don't have good race relations now is because of interfering Northerners during Reconstruction and because of African Americans that insist on voting. Then disenfranchisement is just fixing society, putting it back to a good position. And so all of these sort of myths are tied together to uphold Jim Crow. You need all of them to be able to justify Jim Crow and to defend Jim Crow and the disenfranchisement of African Americans and lynching and violence by saying we are just fixing what was broken because in our worldview, they say, a racial hierarchy is appropriate. And they firmly believe this. And they say as much when they're putting up these monuments. And so there's a very sort of ironic aspect as we now see people try to put up monuments to Black Confederates, because what happens is those loyal slave narratives and those pensions that were given to formerly enslaved people who basically in many cases are playing a role, if you will. They're miming. They're playing a role that they know that they'll be rewarded for. Those myths have evolved, and they're now seen by some neo-Confederates and some folks today as evidence of thousands of Black Confederate soldiers. And again, I want to reiterate, they were not soldiers. They were laborers who were forced to labor. They were impressed, and many of them ran away. And in some cases, they weren't even that. They just played that role in many cases because it was a convenient role. And for a very small fee, you could have this this sort of worldview upheld by these guys. And so they even attend, in some cases, Confederate veterans reunions. You see these guys, and they're not treated like veterans, and they always make a point of announcing how they know they're not as good as the white people. This is sort of their rhetoric that they're expected to put forward. And by doing that, again, they get trips, they get money, they get sort of a patronage relationship. There are rewards to doing this. Now, there's also a cost, right? They're upholding Jim Crow, but individually they're able to find certain benefits for doing it. And so just to conclude, sort of to wrap this up, why this matters is that the way we view the world is heavily influenced by the historical narratives of how we got here. If you see the world as one where African Americans have been given the same opportunities for the last 100 years as whites, then one might argue that affirmative action appears to be reverse discrimination. If, on the other hand, you have a more accurate depiction of history, if you see, for instance, that African Americans have been discriminated against historically and continue to be discriminated against, and have been discriminated against, say, in housing, in employment, in the ability to move in redlining, the way police deal with them, then the way we solve today society's problems are different. And so it changes your worldview, the historical narrative you have. And we can actually see this in polling. We can see this in polling when we look at sort of who views the past in different ways. Whether you view, well, how you view the causes of the Civil War actually has a partisan alignment, according to some polls. There's actually a skew. And so the takeaway from this is having an inaccurate understanding of history allows you to address today's problems in an inaccurate fashion. And so you're not treating the underlying problems, you're treating the symptoms of underlying societal problems, things like racism. And fundamentally, what drew me to this topic in the end was the fact that it is deadly. This is a deadly set of lies. It's not just about what you learn in kindergarten. It literally kills people. And what I mean is, in 2015, the attack at Mother Emanuel, just a few months before I moved to Charleston, has shaped my own experiences living in Charleston, having moved there just months after this shooting, in which a young man who had a skewed view of history justified killing people because of it. And then in 2017, something that led me to work faster and try to finish the book as quickly as I could, we had another terrorist attack in Charlottesville, and where a skewed view of history justified driving a car into a crowd of people. And without that skewed view of history, you don't have the radicalization, you don't have the drawing into the neo-Nazi movement perhaps, and you don't have the justification for these acts of terror. And so bad history isn't just bad history, it's dangerous. And I'll be happy to take questions. And I think Kelly's gonna direct into
I was unmuting myself.
Before your question, there's one last thing. You can buy the book at the University of Virginia Press, and if you use the code 10READ, you will get a discount of like 30%. And I'm going to go ahead and send this out, the link to this one more time for those of you who are interested in buying the book. Normally, I would offer to sign them. However, because we are not in the same place, I'm not able to sign them today, at least, and send that out. So now I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Adam. And we've got a lot of questions for you. One from Zach. He says, what is your response to the neo-Confederate claim that blacks fought in the Confederate Army? And I think you touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, let me go in more depth. I mean, this is a really good point. Well, the first thing is, you don't have to take my word for it. Take the Confederates' word for it. It was literally illegal to enlist black troops until March of 1865. So literally, it is a matter of weeks before the war ends. And they're still debating it at the end. There's like people who are like, we can't do this. We can't do this. And literally what they're saying is, we will, when they finally do legalize enlisting blacks, and they never actually do it. They never actually form a unit. They try to, but it's too late by then because the war is basically over. The idea is, we will sacrifice some slaves to save slavery, right? So we'll offer perhaps limited emancipation to these individuals in exchange for saving the institution of slavery. But it doesn't happen. They don't even enlist them. And again, it's not till March. What you have is these pensions are very clear when you read the documents and you read the letters. And the pensions are the most common piece of evidence people cite. Look, he has a soldier's pension. It's true that the document that these African Americans submit, it often says soldier's pension at the top, because they didn't even make a form for the enslaved people to have their own pension form. Instead, what you'll see is that the clerks will cross out soldier and write slaves on the top. And they'll cross out the spot where it says enlisted in blank unit, and they'll sort of do an insert, right? And they'll say, whose master enlisted in said unit. It's very clear that the loyalty is not to the Confederacy, because they're not citizens. They can't have loyalty to the state. They have loyalty to their owners. And so if you'd asked Julian Carr were the Confederate soldiers, he'd be horrified at the thought that there were Confederate soldiers. There is, in fact, he would be just horrified at the thought that you're saying that he would fight alongside of someone who's black and that they were equal. He does not want to be seen equal. There's an incident where a cook, an African-American cook in South Carolina, is able to get a pension earlier than he should, according to the law. Somebody sort of messes up along the way. And the controversy isn't whether or not this guy deserves a pension. The controversy is that he's getting an equal pension. Some people are like, oh, it's okay to give him a pension because he did labor. People are upset that they gave him a pension because he had a soldier's pension. You can't have a soldier's pension. You can have a slave pension that's smaller. That's okay, because that reifies Jim Crow. But you can't have an equal pension. And so there aren't black troops. And there were thousands of black troops, we know it, because people like Joseph Glathar and his excellent book on General Lee's army, he linked over 500 soldiers. He went through the Confederate Army, this whole massive sample he took, and linked them to the census records. And none of them showed up as black. And if there were really some large percentage of the Confederate Army that was African American, it would show up in these studies. And actually, the few times you do find individuals who are cited, frequently what you find is that these sort of examples that sort of are the exceptions that prove the rule. You have like an individual who's trying to pass as white, manages to get enlisted, and then he gets kicked out when they realize he's black, because it's not allowed. There are thousands, though, and this is something that needs more work and needs more research. We don't know the exact numbers yet, as far as I can tell, but it's probably hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who are forced to labor for the Confederacy, not just at the front lines, not just digging trenches, but in the ironworks, in the niter beds where they're sort of making gunpowder, in mines, any sort of industry behind the front. Enslaved people are being used to sort of build that labor, but they're not being armed, they're not being sent to the front. And Confederate soldiers are pretty clear on that. And the pensioners are pretty clear on that. In fact, every time a widow gets denied, an enslaved person's widow who tries to get a widow's pension, like a Confederate soldier widow would be able to, it gets denied, and they'll say there were no Negro soldiers in the Confederate Army. So even the pensioners knew that there were no black soldiers.
All right. And David says, David Blight has detailed how the scholarly interpretations of the Civil War have morphed over the decades, depending upon the concerns of each generation of historians. Have you traced the morphing of explanations of the war, beginning with Edward Pollard in The Lost Cause?
Yeah, it's a great question. And David Blight's book is, of course, a foundational work for all of us. And if I'm being totally honest, he trained me. So I am partial towards his sort of approaches, as he was my undergraduate advisor. You can trace, the book itself does trace it all the way to the present. It traces the Lost Cause to the present. It doesn't really spend a lot of time on Pollard himself. And Pollard is one of many. So he sort of writes this book right after the war. He writes one of the first histories. It's not the first technically of the Civil War, and it's immediately putting forward a lot of these these mythologies, right? I trace it a little bit before the story really for me picks up in the 1890s, when it becomes just a central aspect of the political culture to celebrate the Confederate soldier in a way that I found really compelling, and I found really interesting, because the racial elements became so clear. I think I probably could have added another chapter that looked at 1860s and 1870s, but bouncing between the 1890s and the early 1900s and the wartime, and comparing the reality of the war and 30 years later, I found to actually be, in some ways, an easier way to draw out the evolution of memory from reality, if that makes sense. And so I really picked it up in some ways in the 1890s. And so many people had written, when I wrote this book, like David Blight, in his brilliant book, but a lot of the works around David Blight's generation on Civil War memory, they end in like 1913, 1916, 1990. That's when I'm starting in some ways, right? I actually start with a speech from 1913 as I sort of, and I go farther back as well, and I'm looking at the war as well. There's a lot about the actual war itself in the book. But to me, seeing this sort of the shift between what was said at the wartime and what's said later is more compelling if I started later. And I trace it. And the other thing I wanted to do that I thought was really important was I wanted it to bring to the present, because Civil War memory matters today. And so the evolution across the 20th century and into the 21st century I felt needed more study, whereas the period from the 1860s had been very well covered by people like David Blight, Carolyn Janney, and a variety of other excellent scholars. Barbara Gannon had all done a really good job, but I wanted to see how the next generation learned it, right? Because really what to me is interesting is what the Confederate soldier tells the next generation. That's really what I wanted to know, because that's what gets passed on and then evolves into our current lost cause myth.
Great. And Clark wants to know, are there other examples of dedication speeches that state violence toward African-American citizens?
Yes. The short answer is yes. Numerous. There's even monuments with inscriptions about it. In fact, there are monuments to Reconstruction violence that are separate monuments. There's also monuments there's a monument in Charlotte, North Carolina, that celebrates the way that Confederate soldiers accepted the end of the war, and through the way they accepted it, ensured the survival of the Anglo-Saxon race, I think is the wording. I'm boggling the wording because I don't have it in front of me, but there's also monuments. There was the monument to Liberty Place, which has been removed now. If you look in South Carolina, in my own hometown, the Wade Hampton Monument, which is in Marion Square, center of town. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been down to Charleston. It's right near the John C. Calhoun Monument. Everyone always focuses on John C. Calhoun Monument because it's this giant thing. You can't miss it. And the poor Wade Hampton's monument is like this little tiny obelisk next to it. It's very sort of, you almost feel bad for him, but you don't when you find out why he got the monument. Because what they celebrated when they put up his monument was not his time as governor. They celebrated his wartime career, but the most important thing they celebrate was him getting elected governor, and the way he got elected governor, which was through fraud, violence, and a campaign of terror. And so his actual time as governor, they thought was largely unremarkable. They don't really remark on it at the dedication, but they spend a lot of time talking about how he saved the South from African-American rule, and that's what was important about his sort of. That's why we're putting up a monument. So there's a lot of monuments. Celebrating the end of Reconstruction, which is in and of itself a way of celebrating violence, shows up, according to one study by a former classmate of mine, somewhere in the order of 1/3 of all dedication speeches he found in his study. I don't know if his was a very like superficial, like he looked at 30 speeches. It was but it's not off. It could be higher. There's even the UDC even puts up a monument to the Klan. They also endorse a book about the Klan that celebrates the Klan as a positive good, and they try to see that it's put in classrooms. And so if you look at actually the rhetoric of the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and the United Confederate Veterans, they're all pushing the Klan as a positive good over and over again, just as much. The memory of Reconstruction is almost as important, if not as important, as the memory of the Civil War itself when it comes to justifying Jim Crow. Great question.
And Carrie wants to know, did you find any evidence of Southern resistance to adopting the lost cause narrative, or was everyone pretty much all in?
This is a great question, and I think it's a really important question that I cannot stress enough. Now, the obvious place you find the resistance is among African-American Southerners. And I think this is really important that we recognize when we're talking about Southern history. It's not just white Southerners. Vernon Burton, who's one of my favorite historians, who wrote The Age of Lincoln, loves to say that South Carolinians didn't lose the Civil War. South Carolinians won the Civil War because the vast majority of South Carolinians supported the United States, because the vast majority of South Carolinians in 1860 were enslaved. And so, when you look at it that way, things start to change. So African Americans clearly resisted. In fact, there is evidence that, and sort of Ethan Keitel and Blaine Roberts have written an excellent book called Denmark Vesey's Garden. If anyone's looking for a book to read after mine, of course, they look at sort of African American resistance. I talk a little bit about it in the book. They spend more time on it, but African American resistance is key. There's another type of resistance, though, too, that is often ignored by Southerners, and that's white Southerners. There is a distinct memory that I think, and my third chapter is all about this. And so buy the book and you will learn even more about this. But there is a distinct memory put forward by some white Southerners in the years after the war, especially in North Carolina, especially in the Piedmont of North Carolina and the mountains of North Carolina, of celebrating unionism, of principled unionism. And it's distinct from African American memory that remembers the war as a war for freedom. And what happens is that memory largely gets erased. And you have individuals who are very proud in the 1870s. They file claims to get reimbursed with the Southern Claims Commission records, or the Southern Claims Commission, it's in their records, you can still see it, to be recognized as a unionist so that they can get reimbursed for any property the Union Army took from them. And there is large amounts of dissenters. I don't know if unionists, and that's a whole nother question about what we call them, but they formed this alternative memory. And in the 1876 gubernatorial election of North Carolina, it is a hard-fought race to get the white unionist vote, because everyone knows where the Confederate vote's going and everyone knows where the black vote's going. The swing voters in that race are people who fought against the Confederacy but are white. And so both Zebulon Vance and his opponent, Thomas Settle, are fighting to get the sort of dissenter vote. And they are, in the end, Vance gets enough of it that he's able to win. But it's that memory is largely erased in time. Some of those same individuals who file for the Southern Claims Commission records, their children or their family members who were part of that claim, and they had deserted, the Confederate Army and took up arms to resist conscription and literally at gunpoint and got in gunfights with the Confederacy, they get pensions for being Confederate soldiers. And so that's part of the erasure. And so the erasure of a unionist memory is something that I think needs more study. It's something I start the process on, I think, but there's a lot more to say about it. And I look forward to seeing what comes out next with it. Susanna Lee has a book that sort of looks at this topic that's excellent. And I think there's a few other scholars who will be coming out with books in the near future. And I can't wait to see how scholars build off of what I've sort of established, or how it gets erased. But I think there's a lot more to do with it. It's a great question.
And Nicole says, thanks for this very provocative presentation. I was intrigued by your discussion of awarding pensions to Confederates as part of the process of creating a narrative, creating your narrative. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading this from the screen. I was intrigued by your discussion of awarding pensions to Confederates as part of the process of creating a narrative about Confederate. Keep scrolling too far. Made me think a little bit about the way your narrative intersects with David Blight's arguments about the reconciliationist narrative and how Northerners and Southerners reunited and reconciled their differences about the Civil War. Were pensions also part of the process of reconciliation? Could you say a bit more about the pension application process? Who paid the Confederate pensions?
So this is a great question about reconciliationist memory. And I think it's important we recognize that reconciliationist memory, this idea that David Blight put forward, that white Northerners had a reconciliationist memory that sort of was all about reconciliation and bringing about reunion. Now, it's been challenged, I should point out, by people like Carolyn Janney have challenged that there's actually quite a bit of bitterness. And I think that's actually true. And I think it's a worthwhile expansion. I think there's always a limit on how many narratives you can focus on. And so do we count about 4 narratives or 5 narratives or 6 narratives you can fight about? But I think looking at different narratives is a strong way of looking at it. I think pensions were a really sort of crucial element in getting white Southerners on board with the lost cause, because it allowed every elderly man to be remembered as a Confederate veteran. And I think that's the key point where it sort of starts shifting into a memory. The pensions are being paid for by the state, though. They're not being paid for by the federal government. U.S. pensions are filed by are being paid for by the U.S. government, and so Northern veterans their tax dollars aren't going to these pensions. There's proposals to do this later on in like the 1930s and 40s, and even into the 50s. And interestingly enough, actually, Strom Thurmond votes against one because he sees it as a backdoor into undermining states' rights, which will lead to undermining segregation. And so he actually votes against a proposal to allow. Now, by the time they're even voting on this, there's no Confederate veterans left. Ironically, they're all dead. There's a few fakes still hanging around, but so these pensions are smaller because they're coming from the state coffers. They're given later, and they're viewed very differently, I think, actually, than union pensions. And this is actually a question one of the first book reviews that came out of the book brought up, was how does this fit with this other literature about Northern pensions? Because they are viewed very differently. And I think there's a lot left to research. There's a master's thesis or maybe even a PhD thesis on the different ways that white Southerners viewed Confederate pensions and white Northerners viewed federal pensions. The pensions, I don't know, play a major role up north. Confederate pensions, I don't know that they play a major role up north in shifting memory. Just because they're not paying them. Proposals to provide federal pensions, though, to Confederate soldiers are often met very strongly by groups like the GAR, and they're opposed to it. The GA, the Grand Army of the Republic. So Northern veterans, you can really see the bitterness and the belief that they are different than Confederate soldiers. They are not the same. Every time someone proposes giving federal pensions to Confederates, because they're like, nope, they do not get the same recognition. They are not U.S. soldiers. They should not be recognized as Union soldiers. Now, how Americans remember them today, there is this overlap that's interesting, right? What other war do we count the casualties? When we talk about the casualties, bloodiest war in American history, you're counting both sides. What other war do we do that in? We don't normally count the people who shoot at U.S. soldiers, right? You don't count Rommel's men when you're talking about World War II casualties. You don't count North Vietnamese troops, and you don't even count Loyalist troops in the American Revolution, right? And that's probably the actual most accurate comparison, because but if you asked a Confederate in 1864, are you a U.S. soldier? They'd be like, hell no, we're not a U.S. soldier. We're a Confederate soldier. They very much wanted to be seen as distinct. And so there is this interesting fact of how we come to view them as somehow American veterans, rather than veterans who happen to be from America, which is a distinction that I think is really interesting and brings into, and I talk a bit about in the book, how this legitimizes the Confederate veterans' sort of claims, and how it draws a distinction between them and other rebels historically who are viewed in a negative light.
All right. Another question from another David. He mentioned that at a 2020 Lee Jackson Day talk, speech about Black Confederates, that the speaker used the example of Judah Benjamin and other Jews in the Confederacy, saying that they had it better than at any other time in the world. Of all the ways one might respond to that claim, it struck me that it was born on a common logic of the exception, a logic where the exception dispels the rule. So question at the core, what strategies have you found effective, whether in scholarship or interpersonal interactions, of addressing the problem that singular examples don't deny broader statistics, much less ideology?
So this is a great question. And as someone who does study Jewish Confederates as well, as I have a project ongoing right now, this is an interesting fact. First off, I think there's actually a giant gaping hole in the historiography about Southern Jews, and the historical sort of Jewish history of the Civil War has really been focused on showing how great Confederate soldiers that were Jewish were. There's been very little looking at Jews who dissented, and it turns out there's some of those too. And so I have an article I'm actually working on right now that will be coming out eventually on that very topic. And but looking at this issue of sort of, and I should mention also why are Jews accepted in the South so much? Well, it's because you're trying to maintain a racial hierarchy. If you're living in South Carolina, for instance, the majority of the population is African American, right? And so you need every sort of ally you can. And so if Jews are a nice ally to have hanging around. They're another group that can sort of help you out if there's if you're say a Protestant white slave owner, a Jewish slave owner down the street is going to be really important if there's a slave revolt. And so I think some of the sort of, and I do think actually there's more to be said also about anti-Semitism in the South that hasn't been fully actually studied because there has been this sort of exceptionalism study. But looking at this question of the atypical example and how do you deal with it, the first, I always try to return to the primary sources. That's the easiest way to deal with it, and to point out that there's often a complexity underlying it, and you need to find that complexity. There's often a misinterpretation. So there's an example in the book I use where there is an African American who does end up in a Confederate unit for a moment, and people point to him. They're like, "Look, Confederate, Black Confederate," and it's like, "All right, let's look at this." And it turns out, if you actually dig into the documents deeper than most scholars do, or not scholars, I should, most apologists do, really, turns out this guy was very light-skinned and was trying to pass as white. And if he's able to fight for the Confederacy, he can then be like, "I'm white, clearly, you let me fight for the Confederacy." That's his plan. And so he works as a substitute. He gets into the Confederate military, lasts a very short time, and the guy who he's replacing as a substitute has to go back when they realize he's Black and kick him out. And so, yes, he shows up on a muster roll, but if you read the next muster roll in the line, it says, "This guy got kicked out because we realized he was Black." And so usually those sort of exceptional cases, if you dig deeper, you can find something else going on. And you start to see sort of, why are they doing this? Questioning the motives. And in the case of these sort of guys who present themselves as loyal slaves, why are they doing it? There's a reason they're doing it. They're getting something out of it. Frequently it's money and protection. You're in the Jim Crow South. You don't want to be hung in a lynching mob. You want to be able to find a job when there aren't necessarily as many jobs for African Americans. You want to avoid violence. This is a way to do it. This is a way to make a little money and protect your family. And so if you start thinking about why people are doing these things, it's not always as sort of positive looking, if you will, as some scholars present it. But primary sources is always the most useful way to deal with these things, is my feeling.
All right, and someone wants to know if you could please briefly discuss the role of the short-lived Freedmen's Bureau and its reports as an attempted corrective to the whites rewriting Civil War causes.
Yeah, so the Freedmen's Bureau is a really interesting organization that's formed sort of its early formation is actually in South Carolina. There's sort of a predecessor to it. As they're traced, basically it's an organization, the Freedmen's Bureau. It's the Bureau for Freedmen and Refugees is the full name if you spell it out. And I think that's important because actually their sort of main task initially is to make sure everyone gets fed after the war ends. They're a federal organization and they're in a massive expansion of the federal infrastructure, right? If you lived in 1858, your interaction with federal officials would be, and you lived in, rural Georgia, your interaction with federal officials would be the postmaster and every decade the census taker. That's it. That's your interaction. Suddenly you have officials, federal officials all over the country, or all over the South, I should say, to be accurate, whose job it is to make sure that people are fed, people aren't being taken advantage of, and that sort of U.S. law is being enforced, and it's being enforced equally. They are not nearly as successful as we might have wished in some cases, and they're stopped perhaps too soon. Some would argue, if you sort of look at like the Eric Foner narrative of them. I'm not sure how much the Freedmen's Bureau plays a role in the writing of the memory of the war. Most Freedmen's Bureau agents are really focused on a day-to-day, keeping people alive, reuniting families. One of the major things the Freedmen's Bureau is trying to do is figure out, all right, this kid got sold in 1862 from North Carolina to Georgia. Where are their parents? Let's reunite them. And they don't usually succeed, but they're trying. And so the Freedmen's Bureau is, trying to figure out, all right, this guy got beat up because he refused to take no for an answer when someone said, "I'm not paying you for your labor." We got to make sure he gets paid. That's what they're sort of doing most of their work on. So I'm not sure how much the Freedmen's Bureau shapes memory necessarily, but they definitely shape Reconstruction in a way that, and sort of the American relationship with the federal government, they're shaping it in a massive way. And what they do become when it comes to memory is they're portrayed as a boogeyman a lot of times, as sort of this meddling from the North, these meddlers from the North who take African Americans who aren't happy, or make them unhappy. Sorry, they were happy before the war, and now they're not. The reality, of course, is that enslaved people were not happy, and the Freedmen's Bureau is trying to help them figure out what is the meaning of freedom. And so they're vilified, and they're not remembered accurately in the lost cause narrative. They're turned into the villain of a lot of the sort of story, even though they actually, in many cases, fed more white people than black people, is something we often overlook. In the case of North Georgia, for instance.
And kind of maybe following up on that, there's a question from Andrew about the faithful slave. And can you explain the dynamic between slave owners and slaves when slaves were granted their freedom but still chose to remain on their previous owner's plantation?
Yeah,
if this is false, why would they have stayed after emancipation?
All right, there's a lot of, so first, this is a great example of that sort of, we got to read deeper. So first off, we got to put ourselves in the minds of someone who's been enslaved. Their entire family is living on this farm. They have never traveled more than, let's say, if they're lucky, they've never traveled more than 10 miles away, because that means they haven't been sold away from their family, right? And their only skill set, perhaps, is farming in this scenario. What are they going to do? Well, they could leave in theory, but they don't necessarily have labor. And meanwhile, you have the black codes have been passed in 1866. You have these set of laws that are passed that say, if you don't have an employer, you can be thrown in jail. So it's an old case of the devil you know versus the devil you don't, right? And what are the other options? They don't have money to go start their own farm. They don't have money to buy land. They literally have the clothes on their back, and that's it. And so how far can you really get if all you have is the clothes on your back, and maybe not even shoes? And you got to be fed. And so you have someone saying, I'll keep feeding you if you keep working. And it's like, I need to eat. So there's a level of it's very hard to necessarily move away. Also, by playing the loyal slave, frequently you can get a relationship that is a patronage relationship. You can play on the heartstrings and say, oh, I was always good as a slave. Don't you want to give, I'll make you feel good. Can you give me some money at Christmas? And so you have to remember, though, you have this moment where you suddenly free everyone, but you don't have a transfer of wealth. And that failure to transfer wealth is limits the ability for people to move. And I think a lot of people forget that. And there's also an element of, you've got the danger of violence if you leave. I mean, and so Reconstruction is one way of looking at it, is really as a period where they're trying to figure out, what does freedom mean? Does it mean we get to leave? And that's not clear right away. It's not clear you're not a slave, but does that mean I can just go wherever I want? Does it mean I can work anywhere I want? Does it mean I have to work? And that's not clear. And so there are laws that are meant to keep you from leaving. So there's a lot of obstacles to keep you from moving elsewhere. Not only sort of economic, but also community, right? These are the people you know. Imagine, what are you going to do? You're going to leave and go to, if you live in North Georgia, go to Atlanta where you know no one. You'd be leaving your family, your kids, perhaps. You got to feed those kids. And you want to be with those kids. You want to be with your, the woman you love or the man you love. So moving isn't necessarily an easy option. And there's also, this is on another level, like, you don't know what's out there. And if you do go elsewhere, you might get smallpox and die. There's a great book called, Dying for Freedom, I think it's called. The name's escaping me. It's a great book, but it's all about contraband camps and sort of the refugee camps. And sort of like why you don't run away is, well, like, it's not necessarily better. It could be that you starve to death or get smallpox. So if there'd been a movement for economic independence, things might be different. But it's really interesting when you look at interviews that are that are given to other African Americans by former slaves, they're very different than interviews that are given to white interviewers. And I think there's a reason for that, is that you have a power dynamic that they have to walk very carefully. And hopefully that answers the question.
Excellent. And we have had a whole lot of really wonderful questions, and we're almost out of time, so I apologize for not getting to all of the questions. But let's end on this one. How do we help descendants to honor their ancestors' sacrifice while helping them understand the wrongness of the cause for which they fought?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think I get this question a lot from my students as well, and I think it's a hard question. I don't necessarily have a good answer. I'm a historian. My job is to know about the past and give you the context. How to deal with the present is not my job, so I can wave on it. That being said, I do have what I do tell my students who are struggling with this issue of like, okay, my ancestors, like I did the research and my ancestors were like slave owners, and what do I do with that? And my answer to them always is, you're not beholden to them. You're not beholden that you have to be like them. You can be, I think all of us hope for the next generation that they will do better than us. You hope your children do better than you do. That's always the dream, right? And so I want my children to, if I ever have children, to be better than me, right? And so you're not beholden to your ancestors, and you don't have to think your ancestors did right. Your identity doesn't need to be tied to them, perhaps. And I think that's the first thing, is that I think people feel this need to be like, I need to center my identity in people of the past, and you don't have to necessarily do that, which as a historian, it's funny for me to say you don't have to be tied to the past, right? But you can recognize the faults of your ancestors. And in some cases, you may find that requires you to do, but you're also not responsible for them. That being said, as I tell my students, you're also, if you gain some privilege because of the past, are you beholden to use that privilege for good? And this is more of a sort of philosophical question, right? That you have to ask of, what does it mean if I did have sort of privilege because of the crimes of the past? But I think at the base level, I don't know that all of my ancestors did things that are necessarily worth celebrating. If I had an ancestor, for instance, who was at Fort Pillow, I don't in this case, but if I did, like, I'm sorry, the actions they took, they're not celebratory, they're wrong. And I want to be a better person than them. And that's what I'm going to learn from my ancestors, because I don't have to be beholden for their crimes. And I can, in fact, be a better person. And so that being said, if you want to honor your ancestors, do so honestly. And that requires a lot of humility, and it requires you to also recognize their faults. And I've done the genealogy in my own family, and there's some individuals in my own family whom I'm not proud of the actions they've always taken. And so that's my takeaway, is that you have to decide, is it even worth, is the starting point. Is it worth commemorating them? Is it worth celebrating them? There's a difference between remembering them and celebrating them. And that's sort of where I'll end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Domby. And
Thank you.
again,
And before I forget,
everybody that jumped in, the link is in the chat, so use that link to purchase the book. And we hope to see y'all on Monday evening.
Everyone should be there on Monday. It's going to be awesome from the sound of things. I'm going to try to make it. So, and again, I'll put the link in there one last time. Thanks so much for having me, Kelly, and hosting me, and all the good work you guys are doing at the museum. Us historians can't thank you enough for making sure that the history gets to the public. We couldn't do it without you, and that's where it really matters.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight.